Okay, then we will move on to the second item, 2018-19 Budget Consultation. Can I invite the Financial Secretary, the Secretary for Financial Services and Treasury to take us through this item, please. Financial Secretary, thank you. On the 28th of February, the government will announce the 2018-19 budget. Since last October, we started to consult the public on the budget. I'm glad to have this opportunity here today to come and listen to members' views on the budget. At the last item, my colleagues have already briefed you on the latest economic situation in Hong Kong, so I do not propose to repeat those points. On the whole, the economy performed well in Hong Kong last year, and we're going to have a high economic growth rate for last year over a long period. But Hong Kong is a small and externally oriented economy. We could be easily affected by external factors. That's why we need to stay vigilant at all times. As will be the first budget of the new term of the government, I attach great importance to it. I also understand the public have expectations of the budget. In October last year, the chief executive published her first policy address. The government will play the role of service provider and regulator. We will also play the role of promoter and facilitator. So we're going to plan strategic directions for the development of our economy. We need to maintain our competitive edge in supporting traditional pillar industries. We also need to find new growth points for our economy, and then we could improve people's livelihood and provide more career choices for the young. We must also seize upon the opportunities of the 13th Five-Year National Development Plan, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Bay Area development. These they will provide enormous opportunities to us. At the same time, we face many challenges. We have insufficient land supply. There's a shortage of manpower in certain sectors. We have an aging population, and we need to look for new driving engines for our economy. So the government will work together with various sectors in coming up with measures to face these challenges. The government will also make forward-looking investments as appropriate so that our economy could develop steadily and people's living standards could continue to improve. And then in terms of government spending on different areas such as healthcare and education, that's been substantially increased and will continue to increase such spending to make sure we have steady public finances, and we could also need to have reserve to save up for the rainy day. So we will spend where spending is due, but we will also be prudent in our financial management. The various measures have been announced in the policy address. I will make sure that we give the necessary financial support in the budget so that all the various new initiatives could be rolled out as soon as possible and the public could benefit from them as soon as possible. Now, as we draw up the budget, we will consult the public widely and listen to their views. We will have the best interests of Hong Kong in mind. Now, for the budget consultation package that's been forwarded to members before the meeting, if you don't mind, I'm not going to invite my colleagues to give a detailed briefing again, so we could have more time to listen to members' views. Thank you. Nothing else? Thank you. Mr. Ronick Chen, Mr. Wu Chi-wei, Mr. Dennis Kwok, Mr. Alvin Yeung, and one other member. 4 minutes each. First, Mr. Ronick Chen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree this is the appropriate time to bring in a new philosophy for public finances management. Now, in the PowerPoint, it said that the government will try to achieve balanced budget over a period of time. Does it mean that the government will no longer insist on ensuring a balanced budget each year or keeping expenditure within revenue? So you're going to allow more flexibility. Is that the case? Now, because then that will mean you could use resources more flexibly. Now, from last year, we have 25 months equivalent of government spending and fiscal reserve. But would you set a limit, for example, 20 months, 18 months equivalent of spending and so on? In that case, and for whatever is in excess, it could be spent with more flexibility. That's the first point. Second point about the wish list of different parties. I'm sure they're going to give you the wish list later on, and then you see which one you could take up. But in terms of revenue, we also need to be well prepared much in advance. So a number of questions here. First, we have a narrow tax base, of course. Would you start studies on new tax items? Now, for the sales tax, I know it's controversial, but what about vacant property tax? Would you consider it? Second point, we put a lot of our money in short-term investment. As I kept saying, we should diversify our investment. We should have a long-term stable investments as well. We'll do something like a sovereign funds of other countries. We'll set up some sort of an investment fund of the SAR, and then we could then invest in for over a longer period, and we could diversify our investment instead of focusing on just short-term investment. Financial Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chan, for your questions. About achieving a balanced budget over a period of time, that's exactly as Mr. Chan pointed out. It's not about making sure that the budget is balanced every year. For example, in certain years, if the economy is not doing well, the government may need to take counter-cyclical measures. And so if we have a deficit, it's really not a big deal. And so, as Mr. Chan pointed out, we don't need to keep attain a balanced budget every year, but rather it's over a certain period, say over an economic cycle. An economic cycle may be short or long, of course, but and when we face adversities with such flexibility, then we could launch counter-cyclical measures with more confidence. Mr. Chen asked whether we will set a limit for the fiscal reserves of the SL government, say equivalent to so many months of government spending. Now, yes, we've given thought to that, but we haven't yet made a decision. Now, in the past few years, we've been increasing spending, and there's a need to do so. And in fact, some of the increase in spending is just to catch up. For example, in terms of welfare spending, healthcare spending. Now, in the policy address, some initiatives are announced. From the announcement of the initiative to the implementation, sometimes the gap is long. For example, for the last policy address of the last term of the government, delivered at the beginning of 2017, there's enhanced living allowance for the elderly. That's a new initiative announced, but it will only be able to disperse that in April, May this year. So there's a gap of some 14, 15 months. It's because we have not included the financial impact after announcement of new initiatives. And then there are other items like the the $2 transport fare concession that you all know about. Now, with an aging population and people with longer life expectancy, there are more and more becoming eligible for the concession. So we cannot therefore really put a cap on the spending. So whether it's a social investment or whether it's spending to catch up with developments or whether it's investment in the future, we need to be bold in our approach. But as long as we also have prudent financial management, then it's fine. Now, even for the international rating agencies, sometimes you look at the line that we may draw, whether it's drawn at 18 months or 20 months or 25 months of government spending, it's still just a line. If we draw such a line, then international rating agencies will use that to criticize us, actually. So that's why we need to proceed with caution. On our revenue, yes, we have a narrow tax base, but I have said before, for the time being, we have no plans to introduce the sales tax. We need to explore long-term possibilities, but for this term of the government, this is not our short-term priority. The short-term priority is to use tax measures to promote economic development. As for government investment, we entrust the investment with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Some of the investment is on a long-term basis. There's a long-term investment portfolio. We have already plowed in some $100 billion. And in coming months, we have agreed with the Monetary Authority to further increase such investment. Because sometimes investment opportunities are hard to come by, so we have to be very careful. But we will keep increasing long-term investment. The return so far has been good. Now, the fund was set up in 2009. On average, the internal return rate has exceeded 10% each year over the past period. Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Okay. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First point about the narrow tax base. We'd just like to point out that on the face of it, we may have a narrow tax base, but with a high land premium policy and so on, we have hidden tax revenue, which is an important part of the public revenue. So if we say we have a narrow tax base, we have to take a wider view. Now, Financial Secretary, you mentioned in your blog recently that this year's surplus is expected to be high because of land sales and with the exuberant property and securities markets, and this all helps to push the surplus higher. Now, you said you won't just focus on winning applause, immediate applause, or you're considering long-term needs. So that's part of your fiscal philosophy. Now, in the past, whenever we have surplus, we will see how we could dish out the money. That's part of the equation, of course. That is about just sharing economic prosperity with the public. Yes, we need to do that, but maybe you need to set certain criteria. Perhaps 20% or 40% of the surplus could be used for this purpose. But then for the bulk of the surplus, it should be about addressing the issues Hong Kong face. For example, Dr. Law Chi Kwong has pointed out that the tsunami of the aging population will be expected at around 37. We'll need another 18 residential care homes for the elderly. Now, you say you have noted this trend, but you haven't set aside anything for that. So do you need to set up certain funds for residential care homes for the elderly, so the building program would not be affected by the economic cycle? And then for hospital building, you have $200 billion for that. But in the past few years, of course, construction costs have gone up substantially. It costs some $50 billion just to build a hospital. So I understand building hospitals cost a lot, taking up a lot of our money. So if you have money to spare, should you not set up another 20-year hospital building program? The third point is about offsetting long service. It's about long service payment being offset under the mandatory provident fund. Now, for now, the employers have to pay for that offset. That seems to be the plan. But if the government wants the offsetting arrangement to work and to go ahead without the employers having to consider their burden and so on. So if you're going to have a huge surplus this year, could you set up a seed fund? So for the employer's accrued benefits in the employee's account, this could be dealt with a seed fund, because each year we're talking about $2, $3, or $4 billion of spending. If you just put $20, $30 billion in a seed fund, that should be enough. Mr. Wu, please hurry up with your questions.
Mr.
Paul Chan, thank you very much for the question. As for the use of the annual surpluses, I offered my views in last year's budget. First of all, we have to look at the nature of the surpluses, and like last year, the surpluses come from the land sales revenue and stamp duty, and the land sales revenue are higher than expected. And for private residential flats, the number is 24.3 thousand, while the target was 18,000. So it was 1/3 higher than expected. And there are two main reasons for that. Among the 24.3 thousand private residential units, and in many cases, the developers paid land premium and changed land use. And this allowed more developers to enter the market and participate in, especially the medium or smaller enterprises. So we had a total of more than 24,000 flats. As for the use of such surpluses, they depend on the source and nature of the surpluses, and we would also identify needs of our society, and we must be forward-looking and plan for the future. We also need to address people's expectations. So last year, around 1/3 of the amounts were spent through tax rebates or rates refunds, and $78 billion were used for other purposes. So this year we are yet to decide on how it is to be spent. So that's why we are seeking members' views on this. Mr. Wu suggested setting up a fund for residential care homes, and last year we did not specify the uses because we wanted to allow the policy bureaus to decide how it is to be spent. If they want to spend part of the money for residential care homes, we have no objections at all. The $30 billion were earmarked for residential care homes and rehab services, and we were able to inject even more funds if necessary, considering the aging population. If you have elderly people at home, you would know that you might not have enough time or space to take care of the elderly, even if you want to. So this would create a great burden for other family members. So we are happy to do more on this. As for the expansion of hospitals, this is something we would consider. As for MPF offsetting, the SAR government is committed to implementing MPF offsetting, and the SAR government would certainly offer the resources required to make that happen. The government would allocate a commitment which is to be used within a specific time frame. But we feel it's inappropriate for the government to invest ceaseless resources every year. For the previous term government, They invested about $7 billion. I think it's acceptable for the current term government to invest more, but we must draw a line. In last year's budget, we did not earmark funds on this because there weren't ample discussions last year. So if we invest too little, people might think that the government has inadequate commitment. But if we invest too much, our negotiations with the labor between the employers and employees might be affected. So if employers and employees are able to strike a consensus, the FSTB would provide support. Mr. Chen Kim-po, I'd like to talk about the new financial philosophy on public money. I agree with the Financial Secretary's view on planning for the future. When we talk about investing for the future, people, the general feeling is that people expect returns in the future. Of course, the government must identify the right projects, and if the HAMA invest in the right projects, they can achieve very high returns of 10% or more per year. When a crisis comes, we would often have no money saved for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Investing for the future is very important, but investment for the future would also help reduce expenditure. This is also significant. The government should tell us the expenditure items which would increase quickly in the next 10 years, and the government should contain such expenditure. So that would be another form of investment, and that is also a very important concept. Investing for the future is something that is easily understood, but let me give an example here. You talked about preventative healthcare expenditure, and if we have more elderly people or patients in the future, we would need more hospitals. But if we can encourage preventative measures such as health screening, etc., you might spend a lot less money in the future. So preventative healthcare expenditure is needed. And another issue is aging at home. We can talk about the number of new residential homes for the elderly, but in reality, it is not possible because you are fighting for the land with developers. So we should encourage elderly people to age at home. Of course, you need to have daycare centers as well. But you can save a lot of costs on residential care homes or care staff, which are very expensive. Of course, you need support measures such as support for carers. And for example, family members who take care of the elderly at home full-time should be paid. So you need to set aside some money for that. Since time is limited, well, you talked about enhancing competitiveness or tax competitiveness. I think there is a concept we must correct. And we often talk about tax concessions for certain big corporations, and this is something what Singapore is doing, and the Hong Kong government says this would not be viable. They would offer same levels for everyone. If the Singapore and mainland are providing concessions to mega corporations, should we start reviewing our practice? Should we still be so conservative? If you have a mega corporations or multiple mega corporations coming to Hong Kong, you should give them opportunities. Mr. Chen, please raise your questions. I hope the Financial Secretary could consider that your reply is less important. Mr. Chen, thank you very much for the question. Chairman, Mr. Chen Kim-po made some observations and recommendations, and we agree with him. As for investing for the future, it is not just about boosting future revenue, but also to address the needs of our aging population. We need to plan ahead and come up with appropriate measures in order to contain future expenditure. As for the specifics, we would discuss with the relevant policy bureaus. As for enhancing competitiveness, how can we encourage corporations to come to Hong Kong? This is something we have been thinking about in terms of promoting innovation and technology. I mentioned 4 areas: artificial intelligence, healthcare technology, smart city, and fintech. The trades have been looking at examples elsewhere, and one success factor is a complete ecology. We need leading players in different sectors or trades, and this is something we might not have at the moment. And in terms of our policies, we should be more flexible. This is something worth looking at. If we are to promote Hong Kong's economy in the future, or certain aspects, we would not rule out such possibility. Next, Mr. Dan Kwok. Thank you. Chairman, I have 2 points to make. One, tax reform. In the last item, we talked about Hong Kong's property prices when all the capital from the mainland rush into our property market. I think stamp duty measures would not work if a company buys a big plot in Kai Tak, you cannot stop them. Or HNA decides to buy a plot, you cannot stop them. So there should be other tax measures to suppress this situation. For example, especially measures against non-Hong Kong companies or buyers. Should we consider a value-added tax? And I have submitted a proposal to the Financial Secretary. We have a lot of business opportunities for our professionals, but our laws are really outdated. I'll give 2 examples. One is our partnership ordinance. It needs some serious updating. Since our partnership ordinance is such outdated, a lot of private equity funds or other funds could not be formed in Hong Kong, and we lost a lot of jobs because of that. The world knows that China has a very serious debt problem, and corporate debts amount to more than 200% of GDP. Very often, these debts need to be restructured, and they require the help of Hong Kong as an international financial hub, as well as our courts. But since our laws are so outdated, the restructuring work cannot be done in Hong Kong. If we can appeal to or encourage the restructuring of such enormous debts, there would be a lot of jobs available for accountants and lawyers, but we do need a reform. And through my office, I have submitted the proposal to the Financial Secretary, and at the end of this month, I will have a meeting with the Assistant Secretary to cover this issue, but I hope the Financial Secretary can commit to this work.
Financial Secretary first. Yes, Mr. Kwok made 3 points. First, let me confirm that we have received your proposal on capital gains tax for property investment. Yes, we're looking at your submission. For partnership laws, especially limited partnership, and relevant legislation on corporate solvency, debt restructuring, and so on. This have all been included in our work plan. We need to amend the relevant legislation for both of these topics, but it's a complicated task, but it's already in our work plan. Thank you. Anything else from the Secretary? No. Next, Mr. Alvin Young. At the end of the month, the Civic Party will be meeting with the Financial Secretary, so I don't want to take up too much time here. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say this to the Financial Secretary about your new fiscal philosophy. Now, you're going to deliver the first budget of this term of the government. I think you're going to lay out a broad framework and policy direction for the coming few years. Healthcare, education, and welfare. The three account for some 60% of government spending each year, because they are the cornerstone of society. This is not something we can move at all. We can't touch them. So every year we expect we need to spend so much on these 3 areas. Probably spending will only increase, never decrease. But then at the same time, we know Hong Kong is vulnerable to external factors. So shouldn't you set up dedicated provisions of even funds for these 3 areas of spending? So you put aside some money for these areas. It doesn't matter if the economy performs well or not, or for example, if the economy is doing well this year, you can put more money to these funds, and so we could save for the rainy days. I wonder if I'm able to explain clearly my thoughts just now in such a short time, but I'd like to allow more time for the Financial Secretary to speak. Thank you, Mr. Young, for your suggestion. You mentioned welfare, healthcare, and education spending. They account for they amount to some $60–70 billion of spending each year, and many are long-term commitments, so they're recurrent expenditure. So even if there's an economic downturn, the scope or possibility of reducing spending in these areas are relatively small. So now we use the fiscal reserve to pay for such spending, especially when the economy is not doing well and the government is not getting much revenue, because we need to continue services in these areas. For example, social protection. And in bad times, actually, there may be a stronger demand for social security payment. So we make sure that we could continue to provide these various services without affecting the quality. Now, should we set up dedicated fund for each of the spending area? Maybe there is not a need for that. Here we're talking about recurrent spending, so we will pay for it in any case. And we could always use the fiscal reserve to pay for such spending. It's rather for other capital spending, say we need to build schools, or we need to build homes for the elderly. Now this is non-recurrent spending or capital spending. So under the government mechanism, we have different items competing for resources here, for, that is capital items. And some items may not have a high priority, so they fail to compete for funds. But then we will make sure that certain projects could get priority, and that's something we will do. But if we're talking about recurrent spending, there's no need to set up separate funds, because these are items needed by the community. We could pay out from the fiscal reserve. Thank you. Mr. Christopher Cheung, Deputy Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I submitted my proposal on the budget to the Financial Secretary. I put forward various measures to promote the development of the stock market here. And that includes launching new stock connects. I propose ETF Connect and other connects. The Chinese Securities Regulatory Commissions also announced recently trial scheme in Hong Kong, and that's good news to the securities sector. And in my proposal, I said other than the Hong Kong Shanghai Stock Connect, Hong Kong Shenzhen Stock Connect, there could be other stock connects, and the Chinese Securities Regulation Commission said my suggestion is worth considering, and they will take into account various market factors in promoting new stock connects. That's encouraging. Recently, Mr. Charles Lee of the Stock Exchange said something in a contrary that is, we must go slow with new stock connects. So, Financial Secretary, do you agree we need to slow down with new stock connects? Because our securities market is developing at a rapid pace. Now, Charles Lee said so. Is it because there are certain considerations or concerns? Maybe are there concerns that our regulatory mechanism could not put the minds of the central authorities at ease? Or would the government continue to actively pursue new stock connects with the Central People's Government? Thank you. Financial Secretary? Now, on the various connects between the local financial markets and the mainland markets in terms of breadth and depth, well, that's something we work hard at, because we need to consolidate Hong Kong's position as the international financial hub of the country. And this is our unique advantage too. Now we have Shanghai Hong Kong Stock Connect, Shenzhen Hong Kong Stock Connect, and Bonds Connect. We have also reached an agreement with the mainland on the mutual recognition of funds. That's part of the Connect mechanism, actually. Mr. Cheung proposes to add ETF, other financial products in the Connect system. Yes, we are in close discussion with the relevant authorities on the mainland. So that's an ongoing task. And I think we have reached a certain understanding. For the primary equity connect, yes, Mr. Cheung's observation is correct. Since the proposal of the primary equity connect, we are now adjusting our pace for the medium to long term basis. But it's not because about the confidence of the mainland authorities on the regulatory practices in Hong Kong, but it's rather under the primary equity connect mechanism, mainland investors could be able to buy stocks in Hong Kong more easily. You know, there's a major difference between the mainland market and the Hong Kong market. They have a far larger number of small investors than Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an international financial center. Our small investors have been through many different financial storms, so they are more mature in a way. On the mainland, there is a much larger number of small investors, but then the market is not as open as that of Hong Kong. So therefore, the mainland authorities have to consider the security of the securities market on the mainland. That's why they need to take things forward a step at a time. But then still, for primary equity connect, yes, compared to the other products, it has a relatively lower priority. Thank you. Now, I also have some questions for the Financial Secretary, three in fact. The Financial Secretary said that you're not going to relax some regulation on the financial market here. You will also pay close attention to derivatives and so on. What about Bitcoin regulation? Now, different countries have different positions on that. In the UK, Korea, or the mainland, they regulate or they do not regulate Bitcoin. They have different positions. What about us? What is the way forward for us? And if you have a set direction, when are you going to do something? Because right now we have no clues at all. Second question, Mr. Alvin Yeung made a point. He suggested perhaps for healthcare, education, and welfare spending, we could set up dedicated funds. In the last term of the government, say funding for the housing authority, the supply of hospital beds in future, the government has already made special provisions for that. So what's the latest position on such provisions? These are dedicated provisions. So is it that in accounting terms you set aside a certain amount? Or it's just that on your record this is a special provision to prepare for such capital spending? For example, Housing Authority by 2020 may not have enough money, so it needs a fund injection from the government, or maybe we need to build more hospitals or provide more beds, so we need money for that as well. My third question, many colleagues mentioned preventive measures. Now you expect windfall reserve this year. Would you consider increasing investment in environment? It could be about air, water quality, or a first registration tax for electric vehicles and so on. So many different items to do with the environment. If we improve the environment, of course, it will promote the health of the public, and that means in turn lower healthcare spending. But it seems that in the past few years we have not seen any breakthrough in spending on the environment. So your views, please, Financial Secretary.
On Bitcoin, the FSTB is already conducting work. As for the Housing Authority and the 10-year hospital plan, as we said in the previous budget, we have explained how we would use the funds. And DHA would be given about $77 billion. And the funds have been earmarked within our reserves. Right now, the money is vested with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and they will continue to invest the funds. And if necessary, the funds could be allocated. The Housing Authority indicated that they have no immediate needs, so the funds are still vested with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. As for the 10-year hospital development plan, every year funds are reserved for the hospital development program, and the work is ongoing, and we have spent nearly $100 billion. As for investments on our environment, we would see what specific suggestions different bureaus have. I would now hand over to Mr. James Lau. We have been paying attention to cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, and there are more than 10 kinds of them. And due to the non-transparent nature and the possibility of money laundering, since they are a form of virtual currency, they are a commodity which would be regulated by the SFC. According to IOSCO, they carried out a study last month, but they are yet to come up with a clear definition. For major financial centers, and in some transactions are needed, and some require a real name registration system. So in terms of our policy in Hong Kong, we will report our ideas to the panel later. Next, Ms. Starley. I have a question that involves this item as well as the previous session. Financial Secretary, I think you have indeed been a lucky charm since the beginning of the term, and the economy has been strong and unemployment low. But when but a lot of members of the public and grassroots told me that life is very hard and they do not feel any joy. So from different studies, we can see that Hong Kong people are not very happy. I think such stress comes from the opportunities afforded to them. So I'd like to see if Mr. Chan shares the same feeling. And our fiscal reserves are expected to hit a new high. Sometimes money is not the answer to all problems. People are indeed well employed, but they do not enjoy good pay rises, and prices are very high. And even if you go to a fast food chain, you have to pay $40 or $50 for a meal, and not to mention groceries or payments to parents, etc. A middle class family who makes about $50,000 would still find it hard to make ends meet. As for well, we only have about 5,000 PLH units. You used to be Secretary for Development, so the FS should be very familiar with the land issue already. So how would you address people's needs? For the middle class, grassroots, they can see that the property and stock markets are rosy, but their life is still very hard. What can you do with your budget? Financial Secretary, thank you very much for Ms. Dari Lee's observations and recommendations. I realize what Ms. Lee pointed out. A few weeks ago, I wrote a post on my blog on this, and there have been negative sentiments among some members of the public. The high property prices and rentals are certainly a source of pressure, and work pressure is also another factor because we have long working hours in Hong Kong. So what could be done in the budget to make people happier? I'm happy to listen to members because you would know the situation better than I do. We are now carrying out consultation on the budget, so if you have suggestions, we are happy to listen and consider them. Before Ms. Lee came, we talked about property prices, so I won't repeat it here. I would say that given today's property prices, the government should do a lot more in the supply of subsidized sale flats to allow more people to purchase homes, whether it's HOS, GFS, or starter homes. For starter homes, the THB would brief relevant panels once details are available. So we will continue to work on this. In terms of employment, in the Chief Executive's first policy address, she placed high emphasis on innovation and technology. And this is to enhance the competitiveness of corporations. And she also wanted to achieve breakthrough in the areas I mentioned. That way, our young people can enjoy more quality jobs. We also talked about the creative industries, especially design. If members have other views or suggestions for the government, we are happy to listen. So that's all for this item. I'd like to thank the Financial Secretary, and Permanent Secretary for the discussion on budget consultation. The next item is the application of multilateral convention on mutual administrative assistance in tax matters in Hong Kong. So let's invite the administration in.
歡迎各位財經事務局同埋稅務局。
I'd like to welcome officers from the FSTB and Inland Revenue Department. The agenda is to discuss the application of the multilateral convention in Hong Kong. Let's invite Mr. Andrew Lai to walk us through the paper. This is a progress report to explain the extension of the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters to Hong Kong. We compiled a working report because the Multilateral Convention is pivotal in Hong Kong's compliance to international tax cooperation issues. The work is very important for two reasons. First of all, as members know, the European Union and OECD placed high emphasis on international tax cooperation. Last December, the EU considered whether countries were uncooperative jurisdictions depending on whether they are involved in international tax cooperation, and Hong Kong was not blacklisted. If we fail to implement tax cooperation, we might be viewed otherwise. In recent years, we had new forms of tax cooperation in terms including the AEOI, or automatic exchange of financial account information. We have already introduced a bill to combat BEPS, or base erosion and profits shifting, and the multilateral convention will form the base for information exchange, and the first exchange will take place in September this year. So before that, we have to carry out the work in an expedient manner. And in terms of the specifics of what we do, they are listed in paragraphs 13 to 19 of the paper, and there are 4 key steps. First of all, we have to pass the Inland Revenue amendment bill, and that way the tax cooperation matters will be incorporated into the bill to provide a legal basis for our work. And secondly, and for the multilateral convention, they are only states could join, and Hong Kong could not join as an independent entity. So the declaration of for extension would be extended to Hong Kong, and once it's passed through the Central People's Government, the multilateral, the document would be deposited at the OECD. When the Inland Revenue Bill is passed, the Bills Committee, chaired by Wong Ting Kwong, already completed its scrutiny, and it would report the work to the Council later this year, and hopefully it can be passed quickly. And after that, the Executive in Council would incorporate the provisions to the Inland Revenue Ordinance as subsidiary legislation. And with the passage of the subsidiary legislation by September this year, we can carry out AEOI with other tax jurisdictions. So these are the main steps involved. And hopefully members can support the relevant bill in the upcoming council sittings. And when the bill is scrutinized at LegCo, hopefully members would also support our proposal, because this is to satisfy the OECD and EU's requirements on international tax cooperation. And we are happy to take questions. Thank you very much. Any questions from members on this item? If not, I have some questions. Mr. Odenchow, I just wrote down a question. Okay, then I will go first. For AEOI, and a mechanism is in place for other bilateral mechanisms. So why do we have to repeat the work on mutual administrative assistance? I believe the main legislation would be passed very soon. If the multilateral convention is to be expanded to other jurisdictions, it would be done by way of subsidiary legislation. Very often, the administration would make a move, even if mutual assistance might not be necessary for certain states. All the partner jurisdictions would be incorporated into the subsidiary legislation. Is this what you are about to do? If this agreement cannot be realized on time, we would still, if we still rely on the AEOI of tax information, what negative consequences would there be on Hong Kong? First of all, I'd like to explain why we must take part in the multilateral convention. As the chairman said, Hong Kong has signed 45 tax agreements, and some are related to the comprehensive avoidance of double taxation agreements, and 7 on tax information exchange agreements. The EU requests all tax jurisdictions to have a tax information exchange platform. For Hong Kong, even among the 45 agreements, not all 28 EU partner states are included. So we have to rely on another platform, that is the multilateral convention, to facilitate automatic exchange of information with other states. And that would make up for the inadequacy in our tax information exchange network. And the chairman asked why there is such urgency to our work, and why we need to complete the work within the first half of the year, including passage of the subsidiary legislation. As I said from the start, last year, the OECD and European Union said they would compile a list of non-cooperative tax jurisdictions, and the EU and OECD would consider participation in a multilateral convention as an important factor. For states not involved in the convention, if they have very few or narrow tax agreements, or if they fail to exchange information with EU countries or OECD countries, they are likely to be considered non-cooperative. And last year, we told the EU and OECD that we will carry out the legislation as soon as possible to extend the convention to Hong Kong. So for the list of 17 non-cooperative tax jurisdictions announced in December last year, Hong Kong was not on the list. And that showed that they had faith and trust in Hong Kong. If we fail to complete the work, our Hong Kong's position might be re-evaluated. And we might not be able to carry out AEOI with most countries, and we could only exchange information with 10 or so states. So this is an important consideration.
The second question was about the implementation of the multilateral convention in future. Now, through the CPG, we extend the multilateral convention to Hong Kong. And if we do that, then we have the platform to exchange information with the 115 states or regions. But it's more than that, actually. With this platform, there are other countries or regions which may wish to exchange information with us, and then we could reach bilateral agreements with them through this platform. So as to which countries would exchange information with us, it depends on which countries would be interested in doing that with us. Actually, in the middle of last year, there are 75 countries or tax jurisdictions. They indicated they have interest to exchange information with Hong Kong, so that's the base list. But if there are countries outside of the 75 jurisdictions, well, we do not know yet which other countries may be interested, but that will be the next step of our work to find out. So you don't need to add each of the countries to the subsidiary legislation, right? Because you already made the amendments in the ordinance. So it's just about including the mutual assistance agreement in the principal legislation, and then when there's a declaration of extension, it would be done through the legislation, right? Yes. Next, Mr. Holden Chow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to clarify certain procedural matters. In the document, usually what Hong Kong has done is to sign the CDTA So the Chief Executive in Council will make orders for the implementation of CDTA in Hong Kong. That's been the practice. But then in the document and from your explanation, this time you're not going to do that. You're going to do what's spelled out in paper number 123, and there's a need to make a declaration of extension through the CPG for the multilateral convention to be applied to Hong Kong, but there will be some reservations as well. And that means we'll have reservations and we're not going to implement the convention in full. And for step 3, after there's the declaration of extension, the last step you take is still for the Chief Executive in Council to make orders to declare that the multilateral convention shall have effect in Hong Kong. And the order will be made under the Inland Revenue Ordinance, and so it will be subsidy legislation through negative vetting. And so I just want to clarify whether that's the procedure. So, right then, so is this procedure just slightly different from what it is now? Apart from these minor differences in the procedure, are there any other differences as well, or are there not? You know, in terms of bilateral agreements, and in terms of procedure, there is not much of a difference than the current practice, right? Yes, Mr. Chow, your understanding is correct. Because now the Inland Revenue Ordinance already empowers the Chief Executive Council to apply bilateral tax agreements to Hong Kong. In the past, when we have signed the CDTA, we will do it through a piece of legislation by negative vetting of the Legislative Council. For this time round, we also regard the multilateral convention as subsidy legislation, so it will still be subsidy legislation by negative vetting of the Council in dealing with this. But why is it that we need to amend the principal legislation, that is the Inland Revenue Ordinance now? Because the ordinance only empowers the Chief Executive and Council to include bilateral agreements in the IRO. But here we're talking about multilateral convention by its name. That means it's not just between two parties. We're talking Hong Kong versus many different tax jurisdictions in signing tax agreements. So that's why we need to first amend the principal legislation, that is the Inland Revenue Ordinance. And then we can make orders through subsidy legislation. So instead of just a bilateral agreement, we can extend it to multilateral agreements. And then there could be international cooperation on the tax front. And then after that, riding on the multilateral convention, we could submit again subsidy legislation for vetting by the Council. Now, the spirit of multilateral convention is that all state parties must do certain things. These are the mandatory measures. But for optional measures, our position for the time being is to do none of those. So you'll be able to see that reflected in the future documents. Thank you. Mr. Chow? Yes, thank you very much for your clear explanation. Just minor follow-up. I don't know if I've got it right. So you've explained that in the past, in the principal legislation, the Inland Revenue Ordinance, the Chief Executive in Council is empowered to make orders on bilateral agreement, but now you are amending the principal legislation to allow orders on multilateral convention. So I get that, but is it possible that you could foresee other multilateral conventions so they could be included as well? Why am I asking this? Because since you're doing it now, and you're just empowering the Chief Executive in Council to make such orders, but maybe I don't know, but maybe there are other conventions you are conducting negotiations on. Would you also include those conventions in this exercise? because I don't know if there are such cases. So you can, in other words, you can make the amendment in one go. Well, Mr. Chow, your understanding is correct. Now, at the end of this month, there will be resumption of the Inland Revenue Amendment Bill, the resumption of second reading debate, that is. And then for multilateral conventions or any international cooperation agreements, then they could be included in the principal legislation in the form of subsidiary legislation. So after we amend the principal legislation, then we have a new basis for dealing with new international cooperation agreements. So Mr. Chow asked a good question too. That is, apart from this multilateral convention we are talking about, would there be other multilateral convention which we may sign? Well, we don't see the possibility for the time being. As for the multilateral convention on mutual administrative assistance in tax matters, is mostly for building a platform for exchange of information among countries. But Mr. Chow is right to point out that maybe in future there could be a new multilateral convention. But if we have amended the Inland Revenue Ordinance already by that time, that will provide a new platform for us to take part in such international cooperation. And then we could just submit a subsidiary legislation to include the relevant convention in the principal legislation. Okay. Any other questions, please, on this item? Technical question from me. I think this is the last question. If you include the multilateral convention in the Inland Revenue Ordinance, yes, just now the Deputy Secretary mentioned that you still need to sign another agreement on automatic exchange of information or CDTA before there could be automatic exchange of information. You need to sign it with different countries. For countries which have not signed any agreement with Hong Kong, what if they ask you to engage in AEIO? Is that possible? So for other tax jurisdictions, can they just ask Hong Kong for exchange of information without signing bilateral tax agreements? Is that possible? Let's say we have completed the local legislation process, and then the multilateral convention is extended to Hong Kong by the CPG, and so that means the convention applies in Hong Kong. And as we initiate a process, we will sign a bilateral initiation arrangement under the multilateral convention of different countries. Is no longer the CADTA type, but rather is under the multilateral convention. There are bilateral agreements to activate the exchange relationships. So we will be discussing with individual countries. But in the chairman's example, now under the current Inland Revenue Ordinance Schedule 17E, there's a list of financial of a tax jurisdiction, 75 tax jurisdictions. The financial institutions only required to collect such information for submission to the Inland Revenue Department each year. Let's say if there's a country not on the list of the 75 jurisdictions, at this point in time, we cannot provide any tax information on our residents to this country. Now, in Schedule 17E, you will have to add new names to the list of these tax jurisdictions. So the financial institutions will start collecting information on the tax residents of these countries. Thank you.
Hi.
Any more questions from members? If not, let's move on to the next item. And the next item is again related to the FSTV and Inland Revenue Department. That is the proposed creation of a chief assessor post in the Inland Revenue Department. I invite Mr. Lai to continue to walk us through this paper. Thank you very much. we hope members would endorse the creation of one permanent chief assessor, or CA, which is a D1 post in the tax treaty section of the IRD. And this is to spearhead international tax cooperation initiatives. And we, as you know from the last item, we have participated in comprehensive international tax cooperation, including AEOI, and work against BEPS. And the depth and breadth of international tax information exchange has gone far beyond the 75 jurisdictions. And over the course of such exchanges, we must make sure that the requirements are reasonable. We cannot allow other tax jurisdictions to fish information from us and obtain tax information which they should not know. When dealing with EOI requests or relevant claims, we have to make sure that the information submitted is accurate and are not in breach of privacy. So right now, a chief assessor would take care of all these applications. With the increasing workload in the future, a single CA would not be able to deal with the work. In the policy address, the chief executive said that for the sake of economic development, Hong Kong would expand its network of tax agreements, and the number of agreements should increase to 50. So the expansion of such network would require a lot of manpower and resources, and much time is needed for negotiations. And under the circumstances, a single CA would not be enough. If we wish to sign more tax treaties, we would need more manpower. And Annex B of the paper shows that under the chief assessor, there are 6 senior assessors, but with the increasing workload in recent years, in the coming year, we will increase 3 more teams, each headed by a senior assessor. So given the wide management span, a chief assessor cannot oversee 9 teams. So with the additional support staff, we hope to have 2 chief assessors to share the work, and the division of work would be based on territory or countries. The 2 chief assessors would have equal work nature, and they would take care of different countries or regions. And this would achieve greater management efficiency. And this would facilitate our negotiations with other jurisdictions. Hopefully, members can support our proposal for a new post. And with members' endorsement, we will go to other electoral panels per convention. So we are happy to take questions from the chairman or other members. Thank you very much. Do members have questions on the creation of this new post? I have a question about the hierarchy of the tax treaty section. Now you have 1 chief assessor, and with this new post you will have 2. When you negotiate tax agreements with other countries or regions, would you always send a chief assessor or even higher officials such as under or deputy secretary, or would senior assessors be able to take up the work? the Chief Assessor Tax Treaty is under Mr. Chiu Kwok Kit, the Deputy Commissioner. So I would like to explain the work of the tax treaty section. We have 6 groups or units at the moment. Each is headed by a senior assessor. And the first unit might take care of certain countries or regions, so the division of work is based on territory. And there is another tier of division of work. We have AEOI legislation for the model text of the convention. Some work is involved, and we also have transfer pricing rules, etc. And a future chief assessor would take care of country-by-country reports, and another senior assessor will take care of the map or bilateral agreements on issues relating to the ordinance. And the division of work is based on territory and also function, and there's some overlap. The OECD has conducted a series of reviews on Hong Kong and other regions or countries. For AEOI or MAP, the OECD would carry out inspections or questionnaires, and the senior assessor would take the lead in such work. And since we also need to computerize, we would try to eliminate paper as much as possible. The OECD has mandated that certain exchanges must be carried out in a computerized manner, including AEOI and CBC reports. And we would often deal with senior officials of the financial ministries of other jurisdictions, and we will see what officials they send. And we find that the Deputy Commissioner of the ILD would often have to attend, and the Chief Assessor would assist the Deputy Commissioner, and the Department of Justice and FSDB would also send staff. So relevant professionals would attend the negotiations. Ms. Oden Chow. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much for the detailed explanations. Based on what you said and the paper, I have some questions. The Chief Assessor would mainly handle the AEOI requests, and according to the paper, the future workload would be heavy. According to the paper, there would be a global forum to help different tax jurisdictions establish AEOI standards. Just now, the administration said that over the course of AEOI, the OECD might carry out inspections on Hong Kong. apart from dealing with work on AEOI, when inspections are made on Hong Kong, well, even if the OECD carries out inspections or questionnaires, they must have someone to talk to. Would the chief assessor be primarily responsible? Deputy Commissioner. Mr. Chow is correct. Currently, the chief assessor would take care of different areas of work, including the Global Forum. The Global Forum is a platform for different parties to explain their work progress and for them to consider whether their work is up to standard. So very often the Commissioner of Inland Revenue would attend. And the chief assessor would often take part in the work as well. And such platform is not just about AEOI or automatic exchange. For CBC reports or BEPS, there are similar platforms, and the Commissioner, Chief Assessor, and their team would take part in the work. And since the workload is increasing, a single Chief Assessor could not support the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, so we need another CA to share the work. As for our regular work, the workload is also getting heavier. 10 years ago, we only had 3 to 4 agreements. Now we have 38. For tax treaties, the workload is getting heavier. The depth and breadth of our work is also far greater than 10 years ago. So we need an extra directorate post to share the work. Thank you. I have a follow-up question. Since this new chief assessor will work with the commissioner, and he or she would have to attend the global forum or other occasions to explain the progress of our work, if other parties have doubts on the work of Hong Kong, the CA or his team must explain the picture to other parties. I think this area of work is very important. Other countries who do not understand our situation might say that we are progressing slowly in AEOI. We must have a public officer to explain our position, because this would affect our reputation. I agree that this post is necessary, and I think even one CA might not be enough. And the post does not just deal with AEOI, but in the future, we have to explain ourselves to the OECD, and other parties would look at our position. If we fail to explain ourselves, or if we do not have someone or an officer powerful enough to explain ourselves, our reputation might be affected. So I support the creation of this post, and I certainly feel that such work is important. Thank you very much. So I'm thinking whether there should be an additional post of assistant secretary or assistant commissioner to handle such work. So a show of hands from members. Please raise your hands if you support the proposal. So we endorse the creation of this post. I'd like to thank the FSTB and IRD for attending. So that's all for this item.
Move on to the next item. An item of great interest to Mr. Chen Kin-po, risk-based capital regime for the insurance industry of Hong Kong. Mr. Chen has actually passed on a letter of the Federation of Insurers. I agree that this letter could be distributed to members. The government's also got a PowerPoint copy, so this is also distributed to members. Okay, we'll start the discussion on this item. Attending this item from the administration, we have Mr. The Deputy Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury, the Executive Director of the Insurance Authority, and the Chief Executive Officer of the Insurance Authority. Deputy Secretary, could you please take us through this paper on risk-based capital regime? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We would like to report to members the development of a risk-based capital regime for the insurance industry in Hong Kong. This is a joint effort of the government and the Insurance Authority. Perhaps by way of background, in 2013 to 14, the IMF did assessment on Hong Kong. It's happy with the regulation of the insurance industry in Hong Kong, but at the same time, it's proposed that we should adopt the risk-based capital adequacy capital regime. So the predecessor of the insurance industry authority completed a consultation exercise with the industry. The outcome has been announced. The insurance authorities and then engaged a consultant to carry out the relevant technical work. For the current capital, currently we have a rule-based capital adequacy regime. That means we will look at the solvency margin of an insurer. That is the level of surplus derived from the value of the assets of an insurer vis-a-vis the value of its liabilities. It has to exceed a certain percentage, and there is a clear definition in the law. The disadvantage of this arrangement is that the risk factors pertinent to an individual insurer are not featured or quantified in the solvency margin. But for risk-based capital regime, that means the risks of the individual companies have to be taken into account. Now, when we formulate this framework, we have to refer to the insurance core principles of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. The proposed risk-based capital regime is similar to that of other jurisdictions. There are three pillars. The first one, quantitative assessment. That is what I mentioned earlier. That is, we need to set the solvency control levels, so that requires much actuarial work to say fix the discount rate in calculating the risk factors and so on. The second pillar is corporate governance and risk management. Put simply, insurers are required to carry out enterprise risk management, ERM. The board of directors of the insurers must also submit and also report to the insurance authority, that is the own risk and solvency assessment report. This is this is an assessment on the adequacy of the solvency margin. The third pillar is disclosure, public disclosure of the capital resources and capital requirements. Now in Hong Kong, we are going to develop the regime in 4 phases. As I mentioned, in phase 1, we're going to formulate a framework. We've completed the consultation, and we announced the consultation findings in September 2015. The framework is to decide on the risk categories, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors allows flexibility for adopting different models in doing such assessment. Phase 2, that's what we're doing now, is we're doing a quantitative impact study. In July 2017, we started the first QIS involving a number of insurers. And after we have completed the quantitative impact assessment, then we'll do another consultation. There is this chart here. Sorry. We expect to do legislative work in 2020. We submit a legislative proposal to the Council in 2020. I'm sorry, this is blocked there on the screen. Then response to the demands of the insurance sector will allow adequate time for insurers to learn about the new requirements and prepare for the necessary facilities. So it will be likely to be after 2022 before the new regime is in place. Now, in the process, I must stress that together with the insurance sector, the professional groups such as the Associated Chartered Accountants and Actuaries, we have close liaison. We've also set up 4 focus groups, and we've held 32 meetings, so we do take very seriously the views of the insurers. We're going to set the ratio and so on. When we do so, we will keep in close liaison with the sector. Lastly, I'd like to say this, Mr. Chairman. Why is it that in Hong Kong we are lagging behind other jurisdictions in putting in place a risk-based capital regime? Well, in Hong Kong, it's a small city, but we have 159 insurers. So we have more insurers in Hong Kong than in many other countries, and these insurers range in scale from very large to very small. So if we want to move from rule-based to risk-based capital regime, we have to proceed with great caution. We need to make sure that the sector could cope with the change. We also don't want, we are careful in avoiding over-regulation. Otherwise, the regulatory burden would be too much on insurance. So it's not about moving quickly, it's about moving right. Now, we have set up the new insurance authority. They have more flexibility in hiring professionals. So they are now hiring more accountants and actuaries to carry out the work. So that's a brief introduction, and we welcome questions from members. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Mr. Chen Kin-po. Any other members, please? If you wish to speak, please indicate now. Mr. Chen Kin-po. Thank you. For the letter, the document submission of the Hong Kong Federation for Insurers, I hope will be included as part of the documents of this meeting. Well, there are 8 key points, but I'll just highlight the less technical points, because for the technical points, no one could follow what I'm going to say anyway. So, in short, the Hong Kong Federation of Insurers support the establishment of a risk-based capital regime in line with the global trend, because this is a more advanced and effective system to regulate insurers. But in terms of costs and protection of policyholders, there has to be a proper balance in terms of the compliance costs. So we cannot overprotect insurers, and at the same time we cannot increase the compliance costs too much. So what is the standard about? Now we need to meet the international standard. At the same time, we need to make reference to the compliance standards in Asia Pacific region, because we are more or less working in competition with the Asia Pacific region. We are competing with insurers in the region for Hong Kong to be a hub. So, and our main competitors are mainland Singapore. So for our compliance requirements, they should be on a par with those on the mainland and in Singapore. If our compliance requirements are far more stringent, that will impact on our competitiveness, so the government must bear that in mind. In the first round of a quantitative impact study, the government has already set up focus groups. I'm sure you could take on board the technical and professional views of the sector through these focus groups. For the second and third rounds of QIS, I hope you will make good use of the focus groups. Please keep them so they could continue to render the views on what's best for Hong Kong. This will allow fruitful discussion. And then the government studies will be of a high quality, and they will be better prepared for implementing the new regime. On standard requirements, quality requirements, now the consultation document will be published in early 2018. But before you do so, I understand some of the requirements will be implemented earlier. I don't know if it's true, but I hope you will first consult the sector and set a reasonable rollout program. That's the views of the Federation, but my own views are that we need to do that. Because as the Deputy Secretary pointed out, there are major insurers in Hong Kong, there are small insurers too. This is a major transition to a new regime. And for the medium to small sized insurers, they may need to be grouped together, and it's not good for consumers if there are no longer small or medium-sized insurers. So there needs to be good competition. That's why it's best in a market that we have insurers of all sizes. It's not good just to have medium-sized or large insurers. I think our insurance authority is doing a good job in this. It tries not to interfere. Can I take up a bit more time, because it seems that I'm the only one speaking. Are there other members who wish to speak? Mr. Wooden Chow as well. Mr. Chen Kim Po. Perhaps I'll give you about 6 minutes to finish, okay? Yes, thank you. Now, for the new insurance authority, I hope it will do the same as its predecessor. It will engage in communication and discussion with the sector, because that's what their predecessor did. You see, in Hong Kong, we've never seen any incidents really with insurers. So I hope we will keep to that spirit. Now, if it's a high-handed approach, then certain views cannot be reflected or incorporated. It will affect the operation of insurance. So I hope we'll keep to the spirit that we've had for many years in close discussion and communication.
Deputy Secretary, thank you very much for the comments. I will offer an overall response before I invite the Insurance Authority to supplement. We talked about the views of the Hong Kong Federation of Insurers. We have no objection in principle. We talked about the quantitative impact study, or QIS, and we have met the trade 34 times already. For certain technical issues, for example, the discount rates, whether it's 4%, 3.5 or 3, we must be very careful. And the insurance supervisors must stick to their objectives, and insurers should understand their own risks. And they cannot follow an arbitrary formula or the solvency margin level. So this is very important to the capital adequacy requirements. So insurers must understand their own risk levels. So that's why they have to submit an answer to the insurance authority. On whether we would catch up with other jurisdictions such as UK and US, Hong Kong has 159 insurers of different sizes. And we understand that the IAIS has a principle of proportionality. So we fully realize the principle, and the views of the trade would be incorporated when we draft the legislation and requirements. So I would like to see if the IA has anything to add. Mr. Leung, thank you very much for the question. And our views are consistent with those of the HAFI. And I'd like to supplement what the Deputy Secretary said. First of all, the principle of a risk-based capital regime would be pragmatism and stability. In terms of compliance, costs, and protection for policyholders, we will try to strike a balance, and we would allow insurers more room to implement a robust system. In terms of complying with international standards, the IAIS has established capital adequacy principles. So we are monitoring the developments, and when drawing up our standards, we took reference to other jurisdictions, including the EU, mainland China, Singapore, etc. And we looked at the relevant requirements in these jurisdictions. We also looked at countries like Australia and Switzerland, and we have taken certain things on board. And to extend the work of the former OCI, we have convened industry focus groups, and we will try to take their views on board. As for the second pillar, in the first quarter of the year, we will carry out consultation on how we can tackle the qualitative requirements, and we will come up with a framework of guidelines. So our target date is 2020, and there will be some flexibility in our implementation. We would adopt a staged approach. And that would help insurers complete a seamless transition. Ms. Odenchow, as Mr. Chen Kin-po has said very clearly, he said there are insurers of different scales in the market. So in the face of new compliance principles or framework, there would be additional costs incurred in order to comply with the requirements, and this is understandable. And the second pillar of the RBC regime would require insurers to carry out OSA. I understand that duties must be discharged, and there would be regular examinations. But as Mr. Chen Kim-po said, for medium and large firms, there would not be a problem with the additional costs or staff resources incurred. But for smaller insurers, can they effectively address these requirements? We realize that the supervision would ensure quality for consumers. But as the paper suggests, you have to consider the issue of proportionality. You have to consider the scale of the insurers. And you should gauge whether the compliance costs would be too high. For example, for smaller companies, they might have to hire extra staff just to comply with the requirements. This would affect the operation of smaller companies. Does any member want to speak? Thank you very much for Mr. Chow's views. As we said, we have fully considered this point. And before carrying out the QIS, the insurance authority has approached smaller companies to learn about their situation. For smaller companies, the compliance costs stem from compiling reports, and when they calculate the required solvency margin under the capital adequacy rules, there might be extra costs. That's why we must collect data carefully. And we are in no hurry to catch up with countries such as the UK and US. Like what you said, when implementing the new regime, we want to minimize the impacts on insurers. And there's no conflict in protecting the interests of consumers and the insurers. The key is for insurers to understand their own risks so that under extreme circumstances, they would have enough money to pay the policy holders. That way, both insurers and policy holders would be protected, and this is a win-win situation. Any further questions of members? If not, I'd like to thank the public officers and the insurance authority for attending. We can move on to the next item, which is the final item for today. And that is the creation of a permanent directorate post in the company's registry. Let's invite the administration in.
Eureka. 歡迎各位。咁我哋今日咧就
Welcome. Today we have the FSTB and the Registrar of Companies with us today. Let's invite Mr. Sun to walk us through this item. Thank you very much. Chairman, members, we would like to seek member support for the proposed creation of a permanent directorate D2 post of registry manager or RM in the company's registry with effect from the 1st of March 2018 or with immediate effect upon approval by LegCo, whichever is later. Members might realize that the Bills Committee at LegCo is scrutinizing the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing FI's Amendment Bill 2017. We will have the 8th meeting tomorrow. In order to discharge Hong Kong's duty as a member of the Financial Action Task Force or FEDF, we want to amend the AMLO to expand the coverage to solicitors, accountants, real estate agents, or trust or company service providers. These businesses and professions have to satisfy customer due diligence and record-keeping requirements. In terms of the regulation of TCSPs, Hong Kong has no statutory body to regulate or supervise their daily operation. We suggest introducing a licensing regime under the company's registry in order to monitor the CDD and record-keeping requirements, and the service providers would have to apply for a license from the registrar of companies in the future, and they must also satisfy the fit and proper person test in order to operate in Hong Kong. And the AMLO will empower the registrar to investigate non-compliance and impose sanctions. And with this new role, we suggest setting up a new TCSP registry under the company's registry, and it would be headed by a D2 post of registry manager, and the RM would take care of the overall operation of the new registry, including drawing up new policies for the licensing regime. And depending on the progress of scrutinizing the amendments to the AMLO, the new registry will begin operation on the 1st of March this year. I now invite the registrar to walk us through the creation of this new post.
多謝主席。
Thank you very much. On the new registry manager, he would be in charge of the new TCSP registry and its overall operation, planning, and supervision. These include the office space required, the licensing and renewal regime, manpower planning, the preparation for a new IT system, and the drawing up of guidelines internally and for the trade. And this includes preparing for seminars and publicity materials, since anti-money laundering is relatively new for the trade, so we would have to carry out more preparation. The new RM would also maintain communication with professional bodies and stakeholders, and explain the new policies and issues to them. And in 2018, FEDF would visit Hong Kong for a mutual evaluation, and this directorate staff must prepare the information needed for the evaluation and introduce Hong Kong's situation, and also attend international conferences when necessary. And the RM must communicate with other jurisdictions. So these are the key roles of this new post. Mr. Chen Kim-po, 4 minutes, followed by Mr. Hon Chao.
Whilst the paper is self-explanatory as to why there is need for this post, we can see in recent years there have been many compliance requirements on an international level. But then we don't know whether the assessment is accurate. For example, in paragraph 12, in future there will be 59 directorate staff, or 59 people. That's not a small number. Every year will cost us $30 million in public money. So within the government, how is check and balance performance that is who would check whether 60 people are enough or 59 people are enough, because in the document you have listed out the full list of staff requirement for the 59 non-directed posts, but do you have any mechanism to verify whether the number is reasonable? Thank you. For all post creation proposals, we have to go through internal criteria mechanism. For example, the proposer, in this case the company's registry, it estimates that it needs so much manpower to meet the new requirements or the licensing regime and so on. We in the paper we have referred to, and then they will first work out the hours of work required, and then they will work out how many staff members are needed. And then, of course, we will forward the proposal to the Financial Services and the Treasury Bureau for careful consideration. So we will critically review the staff requirement. This is a stringent process. We just make sure we get staff just enough to do the work, because we know we need to be careful in creating posts and using public resources. But at the same time, there will be a new licensing regime. There's need for inspection and so on. So definitely we need staff, a team to do the work. But we will follow strictly the government criteria in deciding on the staff size. Mr. Chen, yes, I know there is this mechanism, but here this is a new task. It's not about registration of companies. It's about regulation and so on. So from what angle do you look at the staff requirement? Because the department makes the proposal. Is it efficient or not efficient, or is it a duplication of manpower? You don't know, because you may not be familiar with the post, the work, the jobs of the post, for instance. So as a third party, on what basis do you evaluate whether the proposed staff requirement is reasonable or not? Because here we're talking about 60 staff members in total. If the posts are all efficient, then it's fine. If they do more work, it's not you who suffer, it's the public who suffer. Because you may require people to do more. So in this case, I want to know how you actually evaluate the staff requirement to see if it's appropriate or not. Perhaps I could invite the registrar to explain in more detail. Actually, the duties to be carried out are spelled out in the new bill. That is, under the new licensing regime, there are various requirements. These are spelled out in the relevant bill. So all I'd like to say is that we need to fulfill our international obligations, and these international obligations are translated into legal provisions in Hong Kong. And then we need to assess how many trust or service company providers or company service providers there are in Hong Kong, and how many will be caught by this requirement. So we have the objective data to look at, and we also have data to see how many trust or company service providers in Hong Kong need to apply for the license. And then we work out, also look at the regulatory system that needs to be put in place. So there are a detailed data for us to consider, but perhaps the register could supplement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chen, for your questions. Now, in defining any new licensing system, we'll have regard to the requirements in the legislation, the implementation of legislation, and the status of the sector. So we have taken into account these factors in working out this plan, the staffing plan. Now, we have looked at the companies registered in our records. And then we make an estimate how many applications we will have to process, as mentioned in paragraph 12, about 10,000 involving 7,500 corporations and 2,500 individual applications. And in accordance with the law, for these applicants, we'll see whether they are shareholders or directors. So making the application, we have to see if they are fit and proper persons. So in line with the requirements of the anti-money laundering and the Financial Action Task Force, we have to consider very carefully what the staff needs are. So we work out our staff requirements on the basis of a caseload of 10,000 applications. And then in 2018, the FATF is going to do a mutual evaluation. Later on this year, they're going to send people over to Hong Kong to evaluate our implementation of relevant anti-money laundering and measures. So this evaluation is going to be particularly challenging because apart from checking whether the recommendations are implemented, they have to check the effectiveness of these measures. So we could put in place the legislation by March. That means staff must immediately implement the legislation. We need to go to the trust and company service providers, offices. We need to do site inspection to see whether they are exercising due diligence and doing their vetting and in keeping records and so on. So this is a relatively new piece of legislation, and we need to do education and publicity as well. And that means we need to prepare publicity and education materials. We have plans to do talks actually in early February. For the organization chart of the registry, that's in Annex 2 to the paper. There are two divisions under the registry, the licensing division and the compliance division. For the licensing division, I've more or less explained the work of the division. The licensing division also has to keep a record for public search, so the public can tell who's licensed and who's not. For the compliance division, it will be responsible for law enforcement, and one of its duties is to keep records, because under the anti-money laundering requirements, we need to check whether the licensees are complying with the relevant legal requirements. So records have to be kept, and if the licensees are not doing so, the disciplinary actions will be initiated. So that's why there's a lot of work involved. The company's registry, of course, is also in charge of the loan providers registry, the money lenders registry, and this registry also has to carry out site inspections. So there's already experience in a similar type of work. Next, Mr. Holden Chow. Thank you. A number of questions. First one. Now, I'm a member of the Bills Committee. I've put forward my views. I've written to the Financial Services and the Treasury Bureau. Thank you for your reply. Put briefly, for licensees or for licensed trust or company service providers in future, they need to fulfill the compliance requirements, and I've suggested that they should be allowed to engage third-party professionals to carry out their work, because these professionals may better know the compliance requirements, so there could be better compliance. The Bureau replied in writing to say that it will actively consider my view. So I hope you will take on board my suggestion. That's what I want to say here. Second point, about the post-creation. Now you have a licensing division, you have compliance division. When you need to do inspections or conduct investigations into possible breaches, is there any mechanism to go through some sort of a trial? For instance, for example, if the licensee feels aggrieved by the decision, then would there be an appeal mechanism? That's my first question, really. My second question, well, you are creating quite a number of posts. Apart from the registry manager, there will be 59 non-directorate posts to be created, so 60 posts in total. Now, we know the intention is good because you would want to curb money laundering. But then if there is too much regulation, would you go overboard? Now you are having a team of 60. For licensees from trust or company service providers, they may be worried that with this mechanism there will be so many government staff who may come when they have time just to check on you. So that means that adds to the workload of these providers. So what is your response for these 60 posts? Have you assessed that it's right? You can't have fewer people? And how do you ensure there's no over-regulation? Because the business environment in Hong Kong is such that there has to be suitable regulation but not over-regulation. Because if you go overboard, that may stifle the business development. Now I extend the meeting to 1 p.m. We're supposed to finish at 12:45. We will extend it to 1 p.m. Who's going to answer? Deputy Secretary first? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chow. Thank you, Mr. Chow, for suggesting that under the new amendment bill, could these designated professionals such as the solicitors, accountants, estate agents, and trust or company service providers, could they be allowed to engage third-party professionals to carry out the compliance work? Whereas we will take on board the suggestion. Second point. Now, there is a review tribunal under the amendment bill. If anyone feels aggrieved by the decision of the registry manager, then by the registrar, an appeal could be lodged. Now, third point, now we're trying to strike a balance, although we need to fulfill international obligations. We try to minimize the compliance costs as far as possible. You see, we propose to create a directorate post with 59 support staff members, because we need to look at the overall application caseload. We're talking about over 10,000 applications, and it's not just a mere processing of applications. We need to have reasonable inspection system. So we need to have reasonable work arrangements. We are certainly not going to bother the applicants and licensees unduly. Well, we need to ensure there is a reasonable system for reasonable inspection and checks. So members, you can rest assured we will try to keep the compliance costs as low as possible while we are able to do our work. So just to perhaps as registrar could also say something.
The new registry would be permanent. So we need a team to deal with the or take care of the operation of the TCSP registry, apart from its core function of licensing and determining fit or carrying out fit and proper tests. It's also responsible for enforcement. And with the AMLO requirements, which are complicated, for each application, we have to look at the applicant, shareholders, company directors, as well as the ultimate owner and we have to conduct the fit and proper tests of all these persons for 10,000 applications. We have to carry out the tests on 17.5 thousand individuals, so the workload is heavy. And in terms of enforcement, we will try to minimize the compliance costs for the trade. And the requirements currently are the minimum requirements imposed by FEDF. And we would only look at the CDD and record-keeping information of the licensees and not other information. In terms of sanctions for contraventions, we would impose sanctions or disciplinary action, but we would consider the extent of the contraventions, and when imposing sanctions, we have established procedures in place. We would point out the area of contravention, so this is a rather complicated process all in all, and we do require experienced public officers to execute our work. Ms. Oden Chow, first of all, I'd like to thank the administration for taking the suggestion on board, and the TCSPs can appoint third-party professionals to carry out the CDD. You explained that there would be 10,000 applications and you require enough manpower. When the regime is put in place in the future, would you have any rough estimates on how long an applicant can secure a license, barring any contraventions? Would you be able to come up with a rough estimate? For example, for a smooth and normal application, would it take 3 months or half a year? And would you be able to provide a ballpark figure? Registrar, thank you very much. We are still carrying out the preparation internally. After receiving an application, we aim to issue a license within about 1 month. That's why we would need substantial manpower to carry out the work. We do not want to see any delays in the licensing regime or enforcement work. By May, we have to report to FEDF on the enforcement positions. Any further questions? Since this is a permanent post, please raise your hands if you support the creation of this permanent post. All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the public officers for attending. Do we have any other business for the day? If not, I'd like to thank all members for attending. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.